Hi guys. Today's video is about challenges in communication, and it is specifically geared towards those of you who have loved ones with some sort of condition or background that has significantly impacted their ability to understand, process, and cope with emotion, as well as their ability to communicate with others about things that are of a more emotional nature. Now, obviously, this could apply to a wide variety of people with a wide variety of conditions and backgrounds. So maybe your loved one has something like bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder. Maybe they're autistic, or they have some form of debilitating anxiety or depression. Maybe it's PTSD. There are a lot of diagnosable mental health conditions that have a serious impact on people in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to their emotional processing and communication skills. But even if your loved one doesn't have any sort of diagnosable condition, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're out of the woods and that they're automatically going to be good at dealing with their emotions and communicating about them. A lot of us come from a home life, a background, a childhood where we were not really properly taught how to deal with our emotions, or really how to even identify what it is that we're feeling. And a lot of us also just didn't learn how to communicate about those things effectively. I do think that that's starting to change now. There is starting to be more focus on teaching kids emotional intelligence and, good interpersonal communication skills. But I know when I was growing up, there wasn't anything like that. And for people like me who were raised in an environment where there was a lot of abuse and neglect, where there was addiction and codependency and a lot of those sorts of things, not only did we not get, proper training, I guess, in how to deal with our emotions and communicate them, we got very bad examples of that because our parents, a lot of times, and the rest of our family, they didn't really know what they were doing either. So again, even if your loved one doesn't have something that's diagnosable, if they come from a background where they really weren't taught those things, where they weren't taught emotional intelligence and communication, they're still going to be really impacted by that. It's still going to be a struggle for them. So the reason why I wanted to put this video out there is because I wanted to give a personal perspective so that those of you who love people like us, who have these kinds of struggles, can understand what it's like. And a lot of us who have struggles with these sorts of things also love people who have struggles with these sorts of things. That happens very frequently. But there are those of you who are very emotionally stable, and you are a rock, you are a solid foundation for us, and you do have good communication skills, and you do have good emotional intelligence and emotional processing skills. And I'm sure that it has got to be so challenging sometimes when you are working with us, because if it is something that comes pretty naturally to you, it's gotta seem, kind of incomprehensible that that wouldn't be the case for everybody. And so I want to give kind of this, this first-person view of what it is like to be on the flip side, to be someone who really is challenged in that kind of way. Now, there are a lot of really amazing resources out there in the field, put out by professionals in the psychiatric industry who, have really developed some solid techniques for how to work with us who have these kinds of struggles in a very productive way, to understand things from a theoretical and a technical level, and those are fabulous resources to pursue. And if you need some suggestions for things like that, hit me up, because I have read tons of books and watched tons of videos about these kinds of things. Psychology, like I've mentioned before, has always been my first love, and when it comes to emotional intelligence and communication, I have done extra research in those areas because it is something that I have been dealing with my entire life as well. So one of the first things that I kind of want to cover here is let me apologize on behalf of us who do have these kinds of struggles for the frustration that it causes. For all of us, it's really frustrating for all of us, those of us who struggle with it and those of you who love us that struggle with it. We can be assholes sometimes, not because we mean to be, it just tends to happen. And there are a number of reasons for that. Part of it is us, being maybe disconnected from our emotions, not being able to identify what we're feeling too much at once, getting overwhelmed by it. A lot of us have triggers, especially if we do have a traumatic background. We have specific things that trigger us to feel the pain that we felt in childhood, and that can cause us to regress emotionally for a little bit. So I can understand how it would be really frustrating for you guys. It's definitely frustrating for us as well. I don't even really know where to begin on this, because again, this is that personal perspective, somebody who struggles to express their emotions, trying to express their emotions, and what it's like to deal with those struggles. So it's challenging to even tackle this concept, and I suppose that's probably why there's not a ton of resources out there for this. One of the things that I think is really important to note, and it's something that I always kind of bring up as a disclaimer with people that I'm getting close to, is that I'm going to have moments where I shut down. And that is one of the hardest things, I think, when you're wanting to communicate with somebody, when you're wanting to work with them, when you're really trying to communicate with somebody and they shut down. That is one of the hardest things. And even though I understand why that shutdown happens, because that's something that I do, it's even challenging for me when somebody else does that. For instance, my boyfriend, he tends to do that, where he gets overwhelmed with the emotional stuff. He doesn't exactly know what to do with it at that moment, and so he can shut down. He can kind of drop off the map. And I used to take that super personally, because I get triggered by that, because I dealt with a lot of neglect and abuse in my childhood, and silence always meant that there was something really wrong, and it was always a precursor to a huge storm and a lot of chaos. So I get triggered by that, and so you can get kind of like this vicious cycle, especially when you've got two people that are trying to communicate, and they tend to struggle with their emotional processing and expression. So the shutdown is very real, and a lot of times it happens, at least in my personal experience. I can only really speak for myself, but I think that this is applicable for a lot of people. The shutdown happens a lot of times because we just get overwhelmed. Some people, if you have, something that is diagnosable, especially, you can get very easily overwhelmed by things in your external environment that can trigger emotional things going on internally. And so then you've got just like so much going on that you have no choice but to shut down, so that you can even be with yourself long enough to kind of figure out what it is that you're experiencing, because it can be really scary when you get this huge wave of emotion, when you get this huge hit of, and a lot of times it's very mixed, and we don't really know what to do with that. It's one thing when you're dealing with an excess of one particular emotion, but most emotional states are pretty complex. It's not just one thing that you're feeling. You might be feeling anger and grief at the same time. You might be feeling resentment and love. There's a lot of things that are very confusing, and if you have a hard time with even simple emotions, once things get complex, once it gets that layered, you just don't even know where to start. You don't even know which emotion to look to first. You don't know like how to even tackle it, and it's either, a lot of times it's either shut down, or you're afraid you're going to do something that you regret. And that struggle is very real because, again, we can be assholes. We don't mean to be, we don't try to be. Sometimes it's completely reflexive. Sometimes we think in the moment that we're being reasonable and we're being rational, and then later we look back and we're like, whoa, I really was not. I can see where I was triggered there. But in the moment, we didn't realize. There are times that, you know, we're trying to really express what it is that we are experiencing, and because it stresses us out, because there's so much anxiety with it, because it's so overwhelming, what comes out of our mouths is not an accurate representation. A lot of times what comes out of our mouths is not an accurate representation of what we're actually experiencing. And it can come across as harsh, it can come across as a guilt trip or as a manipulation, and it's not intended to. Some people do actively use manipulation and guilt as tools, and they do that consciously, and there's, you know, a whole lot of reasons for that as well. That's associated with a lot of different conditions and a lot of environmental programming. You know, if you're around that when you're a kid, there are a lot of times when I find myself emotionally triggered and I find myself emotionally hurt, and I say things, and almost immediately after I say them, I see my mom in that, and how, you know, I learned some of those communication skills from her that weren't so healthy. Same thing with my father, I can see that as well. So a lot of times we shut down because we don't know what we're experiencing in that moment. We want to sort it out before we do anything because we don't want to be rash, we don't want to be reckless, because a lot of us have an extensive history of saying and doing things that we wish that we hadn't. You know, it's when you get so overwhelmed by what you're experiencing, it can cause panic. It can feel like a real fight or flight. It can feel like a real survival thing, and you just don't know what to do with it at all. As an example, so my second marriage, I've been married twice. At the end of my second marriage, and I was getting ready to move out, and my husband had a lot of emotional issues too. His were of a different nature, and our emotional baggage really clashed. I tend to dissociate from my emotions. I tend to shut down more easily. That's my natural inclination, and that was even more so the case back then. Whereas my husband was very emotionally needy. He was very clingy. He needed constant, you know, validation, that sort of thing. And I was just not capable of providing that. It was just very overwhelming to me. It was just too much. I was not able to give that to him. And it really escalated towards the end of the marriage. And the night before I was getting ready to move out, he made a last-ditch attempt to try to get me to stay. And he had tried everything he could think of to try to get me to stay. And it wasn't because he was consciously trying to manipulate me. To him, it felt like it was this huge loss that he didn't know how he was going to recover from. And I can understand where his emotions really clouded things on his side too. But that last night, he was literally on his hands and knees begging me not to leave, begging me to keep trying. And because of who I was at that time, because of how disconnected I was from my emotions, because of how avoidant I was of being around other people's emotions and how overwhelming it was, I reached like this fever pitch, and I thought, I can't be around this. Like, I was in a panic. I was like, I'm gonna kill him. I can't handle this. I can't be around this. And I was beyond words. There was no way for me to put into words what it was that I was feeling. No matter what I said, it wasn't going to come out right. He wasn't going to understand it because I couldn't even string words together. And so instead of doing anything to him, instead of lashing out at him, the only thing that I could think to do was to just distract myself from it. And by distract myself, I don't mean like, oh, you know, I decided to go for a walk. No, I started slamming my head against a wall repeatedly, because that was the only way that I could deal with the intensity of what I was feeling, and it was the only way I could deal with the intensity of what he was expressing in his emotions. So, you know, that's one of those situations where I shut down. I became non-functional in that moment, because I couldn't process it. I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't express what I was experiencing. I couldn't deal with what he was trying to communicate to me. That struggle is very real for anybody that has emotional processing issues, who struggles to really talk about what they're going through. There are a lot of times in my past, and this is something I've had to work on a lot, but there have been a lot of times in my past where I have just cut people out of my life, because it was easier to me than dealing with the emotional chaos and havoc that came from those relationships. So, and that's not even just true of relationships that were obviously unhealthy. That's true of pretty much any relationship where things got too serious, where somebody really was trying to communicate with me in a healthy way, was trying to help me work through my problems, was trying to be there for me. As soon as it got too emotional, that would be it. And a lot of times there was no warning. It was just, you know, I was on good terms with them one minute, and then the next, that was it. They were just gone from my life because I didn't know how to handle it. And at that time, I wasn't ready to. I wasn't ready to learn how to handle it. I didn't want to. I just took the easy way out. And there are a lot of people who do that. And that pattern can go on sometimes for a lifetime. It really depends on whether a person wants to work on those skills, if they want to get better, if they want to break themselves out of that. Because to be perfectly honest, it is so much easier not to. It's so much easier to just not get attached. It's so much easier to shut down or to lash out. It's so much easier to do those things. And it's something that we constantly fight. Those of us who want to get better, that want to have healthy relationships, that want to be close to others. It's something that we constantly have to work on. I'm a lot better about it than I used to be, but I'm still nowhere near perfect. There are still a lot of things that I do struggle with. I mean, even today, and this part of what, you know, prompted me to do this video today, my boyfriend and I were having a conversation about some of the things that are going on right now, and there's a lot of health issues going on, a lot of changes that are happening, and we hadn't been entirely on the same page, and I got surprised by, you know, some of the things that he brought up, and it triggered fear in me, and it triggered insecurity in me. And then after we got off the phone, I felt very emotional, and, you know, I thought, after a little while, I was like, okay, I have calmed down, but there was something in particular that he had said in the conversation that had really triggered a soft spot for me, because it made me feel as though, you know, he didn't value the relationship in the same way that I do. And I know that that's not true. That's the thing too. Sometimes when we struggle with the emotions and the communication, we over communicate, and we don't pick our battles very well. And I was not trying to be confrontational. I was not trying to fight with him. It was more just me being like, this particular thing that you said is something that I felt triggered by. It was something that made me feel this way. It wasn't me trying to blame him or guilt trip him or anything like that. I wanted him to understand, you know, that it did trigger me and why it triggered me. And I thought in that moment, okay, I have calmed down. I am rational. I am reasonable. And, you know, it was a good time for me to do that. It was appropriate for me to do that. It was something that needed to be said, and I was so sure of that. And then not long after, you know, half an hour later, and he hadn't even said anything. This was just me going through the process that I go through of dealing with what it is that I'm experiencing. You know, hour later, I realized, no, I had not been calmed down. then. I had disconnected in some ways, and I had seen my my dissociation, my shutdown, as me being calm, as me having kind of dealt with it and processed it, and that was not the case. And that's a mistake that I still frequently make. So it ended up with me sending another message being like, you know, that sounded like a guilt trip. It sounded like a manipulation. That's not what it was supposed to be. I'm sorry. I said what I said because, you know, I value our relationship so much. I value you so much. And I wanted that to come across. And instead what happened is it ended up sounding like a guilt trip. And part of that expression, the part of the first communication that I had there, you know, when I looked back over the message, I was like, there's my mom shining through. There's some of that learned behavior. And I'm not blaming my mom. It's the learned behavior. She didn't know any better either, or something that she struggled with as well. So, you know, I tried to get that through in the next message that I sent through. But even then, I felt like that was not good enough. I didn't apologize enough. And so I sent another message, and I was like, I'm really sorry. I feel like such a jerk. Like, that was totally not okay. And I know that that's not how you view me. I know that's not how you view the relationship. And I overreacted, and basically I took it too far. So that's one of the things that happens really frequently too, with somebody who has a difficult time processing their emotions and communicating it is, you know, we get triggered. We try to deal with it. Maybe we shut down for a little bit. We think that we've calmed down. We think that we've processed it. Then we say something, and we think in that moment that what we said was totally okay, that what we said was healthy, that it was good communication. And then later we look back and we're like, no, that really wasn't. And I screwed up again. And then we feel the need to really compensate for it. And that in and of itself can cause some problems, because that just brings unnecessary drama, and you build on that anxiety that you feel, and you have the shame and you have the guilt and all of that comes up, and it becomes even more complicated. So, you know, that's a challenge that I have in communication as well. And I know that that's something that my boyfriend also experiences as well. We've often, you know, when we're not having a breakdown in communication, that's something that we've often joked about, is that both of us are over communicators. We tend to, when we do communicate, go too far. So it's like this switch. Either we communicate too much or we don't communicate at all, because both of us are trying to process things in our own way. So, you know, that is a struggle that you have when you're not great at processing what you're feeling, when you're not great at explaining what it is that you're going through. Yeah, God, there are just so many areas where, you know, these challenges crop up, and it's hard to identify which ones to even bring up. You know, I know a lot of people tend to have problems with their loved ones lashing out at them and externalizing their feelings. And there are a lot of reasons for that too. I really, really have worked hard to not do that, but it's still challenging sometimes, especially if you did get some of that environmental conditioning as you were growing up, that, you know, you deal with your own pain by causing pain to others, by making other people feel what you're trying to feel. And I think sometimes what happens when people do have that tendency to lash out, it's not because they're actively, on some level, it is trying to hurt you, but not, the reasoning behind it, I don't think is what it seems to be, based on my own experiences, obviously. And that's something I have tried so hard during my life to not do, is to lash out. But part of what you go through in that mental processing as you're trying to figure out how to respond to a situation, part of what you kind of go through is this: I don't know how to explain what I'm feeling. I don't know how to communicate what I'm feeling. And so there is part of you that just wants to make the other person feel what it is that you're feeling, so that they understand. And I think that's where a lot of that lashing out and externalizing stems from. So on some level, yes, there is an actual intent to hurt, but it's not, I don't think it's really, I don't think it's coming from the place that it might seem like it is on the surface. I think it's coming from a place of, I hurt, I don't know how to express what I'm going through, I'm angry, I don't know how to explain that in a way that's productive. So the only thing I know how to do is just to make you feel what I'm feeling, because if you feel what I'm feeling, maybe you'll understand. I think on a deep level, that's what it is. But there's not a conscious understanding of that. There's not really a conscious understanding of the fact that that's what is happening. I think a lot of times on a conscious level, it's more just, I feel overwhelmed and you are the source of me feeling that overwhelm and I need to do something about that. And my way of trying to do something about that is to make you stop, to make the external things stop. And a lot of people that have issues with their emotional processing do tend to externalize because they're not seeing that this is something that needs to be addressed from within instead of dealing with the environmental triggers. Now, the environmental triggers, they do need to be dealt with, you know, certain things especially need to be dealt with, but a lot of it is internal, and it's a lot of people, they just don't have the skills and they don't have the resources for how to cope with it. I know if I had not grown up in an environment where I had easy access to resources about psychology, if I had not developed that passion from a young age to do all the research that I've done into so many different areas of psychology and social psychology and child development and all of that stuff, if I hadn't done that research, I have no idea the sort of person that I would be. I imagine I would do a lot of lashing out. There are members of my family who haven't, you know, been diving as deep as I have, who do that. There is a lot of externalizing they do lash out at other people, they do try to hurt, they do shut down, they avoid conversations that are uncomfortable, they wait until things get too bad and then it explodes. They don't know how to communicate in a way that's healthy. My brother, for instance, I've gotten to a point where I am out of contact with him entirely. We don't communicate at all because, you know, we have a lot of differences in personality to begin with. We've always kind of struggled when it comes to that. But in communication, our styles are very different, because when an uncomfortable situation comes up, when a confrontation comes up, or there's something heavy and emotional that needs to get dealt with, I go into mediator mode. I go into, okay, let's do this in a way that's healthy. Let's set some boundaries. Let's not intentionally push each other's buttons. Let's figure out what those things are so we can, you know, not do those things. Let's not call each other names. Let's not play the blame game. Let's not, let's not lash out at each other. And my brother has said to me before, well, we should be able to say whatever we want to each other and it'd be fine the next day, because for him, dealing with a conflict is, well, you just get it out of your system and then it's done. But to me, I know that from my personal experience, what I feel, and also the things that I've studied, that no, that doesn't actually work that way. Getting it out of your system doesn't actually make things better if you're getting it out of your system in a way that is abusive, if you're getting it out of your system in a way that causes further conflict. Because when you are just saying whatever you want to say to get it out of your system, you can cause new hurts, or you can reopen old wounds, that sort of thing. You can pull up past grudges that should be water under the bridge, but they're not, because the same pattern keeps happening over and over and over again. So for some people, they feel like healthy emotional processing is just like releasing a pressure valve, where you just say it, you get it out, and then that's it. And then both people can just move on and be okay with that, and it's all good. But that is not really effective communication. That doesn't actually help to resolve things in the long term. It's not actually healthy. And I don't hate my brother. It's not about that, and I'm not trying to pinpoint him as being a horrible human being, because he's not. He has a good heart. There are a lot of very positive qualities about him, but it's nearly impossible for us to talk at all because the same patterns keep repeating, and we can't really find a good means of communication that works. And sometimes that happens, and that's, I think for this video at least, that's the last thing that I really want to address, is that all of these things said, there is no excuse for somebody to be abusive. So if you do have a loved one that struggles with their emotional processing and their communication, yes, absolutely, be willing to work with them. If that's something that you are invested in doing and you really want to put in that effort, absolutely do that. We appreciate that so much. Every single person that I have in my life that's a meaningful part of my life, I have had uncomfortable conversations with, I've had periods of shutdown with, I've pulled away from, that sort of thing, and they have continued to be there for me. They've continued to come back, even when I've not been very nice, that sort of thing. And I really value those people, and I speak for a lot of other people, at least that I've known, who have difficulty with emotional processing, that is what we want. Most of us do desperately want to have meaningful relationships with other people. We want to have that closeness. We want to have good relationships. We want to get better at communication. We want to understand ourselves better. We want to be happy. We want to be able to process through our emotions in a way that's healthy. We do want those things. It's just a struggle. It's just very challenging. It can get so overwhelming. And there are times when it's like, I don't even know if this is worth it. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to overcome this. You know, it's like with any challenge that you have, you know, you hit that crux where it just gets so hard, and you just don't know if it's even worth if it's really worth the trouble. And the people that stick by you, you do value them a lot. I am immensely loyal to every single person in my life who stayed with me through all of my madness, and all of my all of my poor communication. I really do value those people. And even if your loved one doesn't say that they do, they do. I've never known anybody who has the emotional processing issues and communication issues who doesn't genuinely value people who stick around. So even if they don't say it, they do appreciate you. They really do. But that being said, there is no excuse for them to treat you bad. There's just not. I do see pretty frequently people justifying behavior, making excuses for people because, well, Sorry, my video timed out. As I was saying, to wrap things up here, don't make excuses for people. You know, have patience, have compassion, have empathy. Absolutely, that's important no matter what relationship you're working on and who you're working with. But don't underestimate the value of healthy boundaries. A lot of people underestimate that. And they're so important, especially when you are working with somebody who has issues with communication and emotional expression, particularly if they are somebody who has a tendency to lash out. It is very important not to become a doormat, not to make excuses for them, not to justify their behavior, because we do need people in our lives who are stable, who can help us toe the line, people who don't take shit from us. Now, that's not to say that you should be domineering, because that's not going to help either. We already feel insecure about our struggles with our emotions and our ability to communicate them and express them. So being domineering and trying to force things is not going to help. But somebody who can set healthy boundaries, even just something as simple as saying, you know what, I'm not going to engage in this kind of dynamic. You know, I love you, I want to be there for you, but I'm not going to sit here and, you know, allow myself to be abused in that process. I'm not going to enable unhealthy dynamics. I'm not going to be part of that toxic dynamic because it's not good for me and it's not good for you. So I need to take a step back. I love you, but I have to take a step back. That right there is an example of a healthy boundary, and we need that. Those of us all of us really need that, to have those healthy boundaries in relationships, because that's what makes a relationship work. Other things too, but that is a very important aspect of what makes relationships work, is establishing those boundaries and both people respecting each other in those ways. So, make sure that you have that. For me, having those people in my life who have been stable, who have been there with me, but who haven't let me walk all over them, who haven't let me lash out, who haven't let me get away with being unhealthy, that has been so beneficial for me. And they've done it in different ways. Sometimes they've distanced themselves from me. Sometimes they've just kind of called me out on things lightly, casually. Sometimes it's been serious conversations that have made me feel really uncomfortable, but they needed to happen. Because I needed to know where the boundaries were. Part of having difficulty with emotional processing a lot of times is not really knowing what the boundaries are. You don't know what yours are because you don't really understand what you're experiencing at an emotional level. So it's really hard for you to establish what you want in a relationship with somebody, what's important to you, what you value, because you just don't really know what you're doing either. And that's something that can be learned. There are a lot of really amazing resources out there for people who struggle with communication and emotional intelligence and coping mechanisms. There's great resources. I've utilized them. They're so helpful. But not everybody's ready for that. You can't force somebody to do something before they're ready. We all know that. It is a lot of work. It is a lot of study. It's a lot of feeling uncomfortable and being very insecure. But over time, you do get better at it. You develop it like any other skill. So that is possible. But even with those resources, we still need practice. We still need stability in our lives. We still need people that help us to understand what good communication is, that help us to understand what healthy emotional processing is, what healthy emotional expression is. So, if that is something that you're naturally good at, don't underestimate the value of those healthy boundaries. Draw that line in the sand. You don't have to be mean about it. That wouldn't help anyway. But, draw that line in the sand. Not, ultimatums and things like that. Just something as simple as saying, I won't engage in this. When we can work on this together, when it can be healthy, when we can get away from yelling and name calling and blame games and all of that, let's do it. Let's work on this relationship. I am here for you. I love you. I want to be here for you, but we need to do it healthy. That's it. It's as simple as that. And I know that that's hard to do. I get it. I've had to do that with other people before. I've had other people do that with me, where that distance has to happen, where those uncomfortable conversations have to happen. I know it is challenging, especially when you really love somebody. You really, really love somebody. You want to see the best in them. You want to make allowances for them and all of that, but that doesn't ultimately help in the long run. And I stress that because so many people who have difficulty with communication and who have difficulty with emotional processing find themselves in codependent relationships. A lot of us have very strong personalities where we can be kind of domineering. A lot of us will lash out or do things that we're ashamed of, and then we just kind of try to brush it under the rug because we don't want to address it because it's uncomfortable, because we do feel guilty, that sort of thing. Don't allow that to be what rules the dynamic. It does take a lot of work. I know it takes a lot of work. I've done it. I'm still doing it. I'm still working on this. This is a lifelong process as far as I know. But it helps me to have people in my life who don't. It helps me to have people in my life who respect themselves, because the more that I have people in my life who respect themselves, the more that helps me to respect myself as well. The more that helps me to develop meaningful and healthy relationships, and that's ultimately what we're working towards here. So I guess that's really all I had today. It was a little bit longer of a video, and hopefully that all made sense. I know I kind of went off on a tangent again, but I'm trying my best to give you guys a realistic viewpoint from somebody who does deal with these kinds of things, to give you a sense of what it's like, to give you some understanding. I hope that it helps. Obviously, the things I say aren't going to apply to everybody in these situations. Not everybody experiences things the same way. But I have seen enough commonality with other people in my life that I think that these things that I've pointed out are, you know, pretty significant common factors across the board for a lot of people. If you have questions, if you need, you know, suggestions for resources for how to work with these things yourself, or how to help somebody that you love to work through these things, hit me up in the comments section, send me a message, you know, set up a session with me, whatever the case may be. I'm here for you guys, and hopefully, as always, I will be able to continue offering you guys some useful assistance and some insights. So I will talk to you next time, next video. I am probably going to be, I'm aiming to do a video on epigenetics and how it affects our physical health, how it can affect our mental health, and how we can make the most of it to bring greater fulfillment and health and well-being into our lives in general. So be on the lookout for that. I'm super excited about that one. It's something that I am very passionate about and I care about quite a bit. So I will see you guys next time. Bye.